Welcome to Yuppies and Harpoons. I'm Joe, co-host. With me is Jacob. And this is our 7th episode. And if this is coming to you a little bit later than expected, we do normally release episodes on Wednesdays. I had a Wi-Fi malfunction back in my apartment, and Xfinity messaged me, and they said, "You will not have any connection tonight." And I was like, "Oh, that's wonderful." So now I'm currently on a Thursday.
So therefore, we don't have any podcast.
That's right. Yeah, there's no Wi-Fi, there's no podcast, and so I've resorted to, I guess, some sort of Soviet-style bunker here at my school where we have dependable Wi-Fi for today.
The good news is if there's a nuclear attack, Joe will survive in his bunker and the podcast will continue. So
I will.
Fear not.
I will. I may or may not be on a security shift right now. That aside, we have a bunch of topics that we're going to try and dive into today, like I dived into Soviet bunker. So we're going to be discussing briefly. We're going to go over some of the current events today. Senator Romney announced his retirement from the Senate. We have the impeachment inquiry with Speaker McCarthy initiating over in the House. And there's also some rather significant global catastrophes like the flooding in Libya, which wiped out a city of 500,000 people. And so lots to kind of briefly comment on here, Jacob. What are your thoughts on specifically with our last podcast where we were talking about older politicians and gerontocracy, and Mitt Romney here choosing to not run for re-election? He's currently 76 years old.
Yeah, I think we'll dive into the impeachment, but I think my new criteria for people running for office, it used to be they have really good morals and good policies. Now it's just trimming down to, can we get a candidate who's not impeached or have impeachment inquiries against them and are under the age of 80? Those are my now 2 requirements I'm looking for a presidential run. But yeah, with Romney, it's kind of major news. He's been a presidential candidate at one point, and a senator for many years, and a governor as well, pretty successful governor, I think, by most measures. So, but I feel like in the last few years has lost the favor of the party.
Yeah.
He's definitely the leader of the rhinos.
Yeah, he hasn't really changed. Well, and it's just it's interesting. When you read the article in the Atlantic, where he's detailing why he stepped down. I mean, there was a whole host of factors, but one thing he mentioned was that he really wanted to let the younger generation take control of the future of the country. He said that we've had our time, and and then proceeded to criticize both Trump and Biden. And implicit in that it was their age. And obviously what's interesting about Romney is that he's certainly, you don't see sort of any mental decline, but he commented that if he were to run for re-election again, his Senate term would take him into the middle of his 80s. And this is just someone that I feel like had the humility and also kind of the foresight to be like, yeah, maybe that's not the best thing. Before anyone interjects that he wasn't going to win re-election, he was leading in his primary polls. He was the first among a scattered field. Now, maybe he was worried about everyone like coalescing around one opposition candidate, but the point is that he was ahead in the polls. I don't think that that there was just Romney's popular in Utah, and I think there was a very, very good chance he would have been reelected. And so for me, this kind of comes off as a man who's has a lot of wisdom, and someone that's been in the party and been an influential figure here in the for the Republican Party for the past 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether you like him or not, whether you're in the Democrat Party and you don't like Romney because he's Republican, or if you're one of the many Republicans who think he's a rhino and don't like him for that, at the very least, he's served his time. He's been very effective in a lot of what he does. He's very popular with his people. So I think there's something to mention on the topics. He sounds like a rhino. It's what his constituents want, which is ultimately his job is to represent his constituents. And he's choosing to go out, which is big. And like we talked about last episode, these candidates who are in office who the cognitive ability is questionable at best. I think after our recording of the last episode, Nancy Pelosi started rumors. She mentioned at a fundraiser that she would be rerunning. So, passing the baton to the next generation, I think, is huge, and you have to know when to say no. So I give a lot of props to Mitt Romney for doing that, because he easily could re-win, but he's choosing to step down, kind of like George Washington, knowing when to step down.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to the bigger news. I'm a personal devotee of Mitt Romney, so I had to mention that. I've followed him for years. I love what he did in Massachusetts. I think he was a phenomenal governor. But moving on to the more trendy subjects of impeachment inquiries and the House and Hunter Biden and our current president. Speaker McCarthy decided to initiate a House impeachment inquiry into President Biden. There's a lot of speculation that the reason he did this was because of pressure that he was receiving from members of the far right in his caucus, specifically Matt Gaetz from Florida, who was saying that, he might want to try and recall Speaker McCarthy, which is just another word for they can hold a vote for Speaker again if one representative comes forward and petitions that they have the vote. And that was one of the negotiated elements of McCarthy's speakership. There was a concession he had to make to the House Freedom Caucus in order to become Speaker. And so he's exceptionally vulnerable when just one member of his coalition breaks out and says, if you don't do this, then we're going to have a vote again about your on your speakership. And for those who don't remember, I think it was there were 18 ballots or something that had to be cast, or 18 votes that had to be counted until he was actually confirmed as Speaker. So rerunning that headache again is probably something he has no desire to do or repeat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a big factor for McCarthy. He's had a tough go here with the far right members of the party, really forcing issues that aren't popular with the public, aren't popular with in terms of priorities as well of what we need to do as a country, but are forcing his hand into things like impeachment inquiry. So this isn't an actual impeachment. It's just kind of to discover whether or not we should move forward with one. One thing to note is they didn't take a vote to move forward with this, which is similar to what Nancy Pelosi did with Trump. So you can argue that it's not a proper impeachment because there's no vote for the inquiry, which is what Donald Trump argued during his. But to me, I feel like it's going to be a litmus test of sorts. Whether or not you support the impeachment of Biden is going to be whether or not you're a Republican. I feel like that's a little bit where this is going as well. I don't think going to benefit the country by any means. People either like Biden or they don't. And I think similar to Trump, there was very minimal impact on polling and his support under two impeachments. Definitely under the first impeachment. And I think, they're really trying to kind of force a litmus test of, are you Republican enough by supporting this or not? And it's going to be a lot of resources used when there was other ways they could investigate Biden and a lot of the evidence that they have on him and Hunter Biden. But they chose to go impeachment because I think it makes a statement. They impeached Trump, we're going to impeach you, vice versa. Kind of tit for tat type tactics.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think some of it's deserved. It's tough because I think what the impeachments have shown is that presidents do a lot of things that are impeachable, and nobody ever moves forward on impeachment. And when you're talking about subpoena, like trying to subpoena records back when Joe Biden was vice president. should he be impeached for that? Would it surprise me that he was actually was not someone who had upstanding character and was using his son to basically fly around the world and pick up bags of cash? No, it wouldn't surprise me at all. He lives in Wilmington, Delaware. I know where Wilmington, Delaware is. I've been to Wilmington, Delaware. It's not that far from DC. And he's been in Washington for 50 plus years. I mean, and so there's that element of it's just like standard old corruption. But then there's also, if we are going to use a fine tooth and fine comb for President Trump, then I guess we do need to do the same thing for President Biden. And so if that's kind of the route we're going down, to me, it seems inevitable that this just seemed inevitable that it was going to happen. Now, as far as a litmus test, I think what's interesting is that the reason they didn't have a House vote on the impeachment inquiry was because there were Republicans who weren't willing to commit to voting for it, because they have a majority in the House. And so you would think that if McCarthy had the option to have a vote in favor of the impeachment inquiry, he would prefer that over not holding a vote at all, because that just looks weak. So I think the fact that he did not hold a vote shows that there may not be a majority of Republicans who think that it's there's a convincing amount of evidence to spark an impeachment inquiry, and so that's definitely worth noting. And it's also worth noting that McCarthy nevertheless went forward with it, because of maybe some of his relationships, the sour relationships that he has with people in the Freedom Caucus and people like Matt Gaetz.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think this is beneficial to move forward with this at this point in time. I think there's a lot of other ways you can investigate Biden and pull out a lot of this corruption for the public to know. And like you were saying, I mean, you can always find something to impeach people on. It's whether you look heavy or not, and you can make the case for it. I don't think this is going to be something that anyone's shocked by. The news is out there by. There's not a lot of upcry, like people freaking out over this. So it's not going to move to Biden being removed from office. So therefore, it's almost kind of, well, why is it even being wasted resources on then? But even if I did think that this was a good idea, I completely disagree with the strategy of Matt Gaetz. He was in a press conference, he said, we've waited 8-9 months here and we haven't gotten what we wanted from, McCarthy. If you wanted to push this back a little bit further, though, and then you start pushing into the election, and at the same time you have Trump being indicted and on trial, you have the impeachment trials going on, and play with the headlines that way. If you're really going at it from a litmus test, who's the Republican Party, we play hardball. They call out that Trump's trials being set up during Super Tuesday and some other big dates next year running up to election. Why don't you play hardball then with Biden and set up the impeachment inquiry at the same time? So it's a distraction there and also dominates the headlines. So it's kind of a strange, if they are going to move forward with it, why would you, let's wait a little bit. There's still a lot of information to collect. It's not like they're delaying while they're sitting on all this information. There's still some question marks about how is everything perfectly tied in. So there's still investigations to do, which the inquiry will uncover. Or not discover anything, but it's kind of an interesting timing there. But
yeah, because the thing is that he'll be acquitted by the Senate. But what's interesting is it's a really fascinating point that you could have dual trials happening at the same time if you time this right. And we kind of put if you have an impeachment, vote. Maybe their thought is that this is the first of more impeachments. Who knows? Maybe they want to get Biden 3 times to topple Trump's 2.
Set the standard.
Yeah. So
that's moving into one of Biden's successes. Oh yeah.
No, it just sounds like a never-ending carousel. So
yeah. But moving into Biden's successes, we have Bidenomics, which is the crown jewel of this administration. He cannot stop talking about the strength of the economy under Bidenomics. with data coming out that cannot dispute the golden award that he deserves. Some of this includes poverty rates actually going up in 2022 versus 2021, and inflation continues to rise. So we're at 3.7 is what the consumer price index showed today. So moving in the opposite direction of back towards that 2% margin. So just a kind of quick update, Bidenomics still working flawlessly, is helping every American, while they also erode the dollar and are in childhood poverty rates increase. So some good things there for the Biden front.
So you're not a fan of Bidenomics? What is Bidenomics? I mean, I hear this term. I heard Biden use it, and I hate how presidents I think it was Obamacare, Bidenomics. Like I just get so tired.
I think it was Milton Friedman, and I could be completely wrong. Please comment if you know who I'm quoting here. But after Reagan's administration, they said we can never have a president that last name ends with an N ever again for the sake of economics, because it's too easy to flow it. So you have Reaganomics famously. Now you have Bidenomics. It just works, right? It ends in an N. You can tie it in. It flows well. I think it's catchy. It sounds good, but I don't know what it is. And if it is what it is, if this is the economy that it produces Bidenomics, I want far from it. I mean, this is horrible. Inflation eroding the dollar. Americans are having less disposable income, focusing more on paycheck to paycheck. The average American does not have $400 to save for emergency fund. I mean, there's nothing positive about Bidenomics that I've come to find, besides the fact that the name is catchy, and I think that's what they're going off of.
I mean, so. Yeah, it's weird because so I'll push back a little bit, but it is kind of strange because I think the circumstance that our country is in terms of economically speaking, coming out of the pandemic and how we've recovered, I actually think we've done quite well compared to other countries. The amount of money that we've spent has been lower per GDP, I think, than most European countries. And if you look at the rates of inflation across the world, around the world, I mean, we're in one of the most conservative. I mean, we're one of the most conservative countries when it comes to inflation. Now, that being said, if I continue on that road, if you go, for instance, if you go to Canada, things are significantly cheaper because the dollar is so much stronger. If you go, when I was over in Europe, I mean, the Swiss franc and the U.S. dollar were almost equal, which was unheard of. And when you look at the dollar and the pound, and the dollar and the euro, the dollar internationally has actually gotten much stronger because of how much worse everyone's economic situation has been. What I think is really weird is that I still don't know if I'd attach my name to something because it was the least bad. Like if we're still having inflation and people are having less and less available funds to be able to save up for an emergency, I don't know if I'd attach my name to that now, because if I'm like, okay, well, you know what, you may not even have $400 in your savings account, but man, you're lucky I'm your president, because if you were in a different country, you'd only have $100. Like, see, like I'm all that. It's like no, people don't buy that. All you'll get is the bird. You get flip the bird if you try to run on that sort of a platform. So I don't know. To me, it's really, really hard to ever give a president a grade on economics. I think you can look at certain provisions that they pass. I think that Trump was pretty good for the economy. I think the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a good bill. It was a good and enforcing a global minimum tax to be able to incentivize offshore money to come back into the U.S. and lowering the corporate tax from 37% to 21%. I think those are good economic
and doubling the standard deduction. So it wasn't just corporations getting tax breaks, but every tax break had a massive benefit from it too as well.
Yeah.
I think that's very important to mention.
But I think the corporate structure, the corporate restructuring, the corporate tax restructuring that bill did was actually much more significant, because what they had to do is they had to do the standard deduction. And listen, I support the standard deduction. I hope that those tax cuts are renewed in 2025. But there's a reason that the individual, the standard deduction and a lot of those individual benefits were set for expiration for 2025. And it is because those weren't the core essential parts of the bill. What that bill was meant to do was it made it expensive for you to store your money abroad, and it brought tons of money from multinational corporations headquartered in America. It brought that money into the U.S., and that's why after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed, you actually saw government revenue increase. It was because of all the offshore money flowing back into U.S. markets. And so,
and this is like Apple Corporation, they had over $200 billion sitting in offshore accounts that they would not repatriate because of the tax burden. So, there was massive corporations with $200 billion. That's a massive company on its own. And that was just cash reserve sitting overseas. And that's now, coming back to the States somewhat.
Now, I think in terms of like the way that President Biden has performed, to me, it's pretty interesting. Like, the Democrat Party has not been the progressive tax hawks that I was expecting them to be. Like, they had a pretty good opportunity to do some major tax reform bills. I mean, Joe Manchin even supported raising the corporate tax rate. And so you certainly could have used one of your reconciliation bills to actually spike the corporate tax rate and to basically do a lot of reforms to undo a lot of the reforms that the tax cuts in 2017 accomplished. And Biden hasn't done that. And I think that you have to give him a little bit of credit to just kind of deciding not to jump on an issue that would get him a lot of support on the left out of, I would say, recognition that the reforms were actually good. And I'll add this. Those reforms, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which everyone calls the Trump's tax cuts, that was actually an extension of the, I believe it was the 2014 tax cuts that were passed on a bipartisan basis under Obama. This was essentially the extension of those tax cuts. It was something that they were planning to pass, and it was largely negotiated by Paul Ryan and the Obama administration. And really, that legal skeleton was then put into place here for in 2017 when it was passed under Trump. And so Biden was around when that was a lot of this stuff was being negotiated back in the Obama administration. And so I do give him some credit for not jumping on the opportunity to just overturn something for the heck of it.
Well, I don't think he's had the support to do that. And the ones that he has, so with the Inflation Reduction Act, raises the corporate minimum tax to 15%. There's some other ways that he also filed in, taxes throughout, but overall has kept it fairly sustainable. And then the other thing to mention would be increase in IRS, the size of the IRS, which that is looking to then just collect more taxes that exist through audits and things like that. So I think that's been their way around not being able to push through a comprehensive tax reform like Trump did.
Yeah, certainly.
But yeah, you haven't seen much of that, but he's focused a lot on some other policies like climate change and the Inflation Reduction Act, which directly contributed to 2% more inflation, according to the government CBO, saying increased inflation there. So a lot of his policies have looked to increase inflation, where at the same time haven't really increased taxes a whole lot in certain in what he, I guess, campaigned on.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that that's right, and but I think we also need to move on and get to one of the main subjects that we wanted to discuss today, which was immigration. That's a fairly broad subject, and I don't think we're not gonna cover. We shoot for an hour on these podcasts, and I don't think we're gonna cover immigration in the remaining 35 minutes. But from my understanding, it's been on the news a lot lately, and I think it has a lot to do with illegal border crossings, how they have drastically increased. The Biden administration electing not to renew Title 42, and then there's being debate about if they're going to do that, and all of these complications. Setting them aside, we have a massive problem on the border with what looks to be almost 2 million people crossing the border on an annual basis. I think if that's correct.
Yes.
And
yep.
so at this point, we're looking at close to 6 million people by the end of 2023 having crossed the border illegally during the Biden administration. And so it kind of just brings the question to the table over, why is this happening? What is the purpose of immigration? And what should the response be to this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, you see the change in course with him. New York City is a sanctuary city. He ran on that platform, but lately in the last few weeks has really come out with some extremely serious language around the problem on their hands in New York City, where you have dozens of hotels filled with immigrants, many with asylum status. So just to give you some quick data here, there's 130,000 total hotels in New York City. Nearly 50% of those are filled by migrants. So just a massive number. And what this has done why this has happened is New York has a right to house policy. So if you are there for more than 24 hours, you have a right to a place to sleep. So the solution has been fill the hotels. And they're paying on average $316 a night for these hotels. So what that has then boiled over to is a strain on the government funds. So they're spending billions and billions of dollars now to house these migrants, not to mention the services that they use. And they can't afford it anymore. They have to slash services. And Eric Adams, who is very pro open borders, is now reversing course. And New York is kind of backing him on this as well. So there's a different sentiment. There was rallies held today in showing support of Eric Adams' change of course on immigration and calling both the governor of New York and also on Biden to help with this problem.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think there was something with they were getting so desperate that they're looking for people that had lived in government housing to see if they have available rooms. And so there was something like 36% of New York residents are overhoused, and there's a lot of debate over what that even means, because the question is, if you have too many people living in your apartment, does that mean all your bedrooms are full, or does it mean that because you might have 3 rooms and a kitchen, right? But one room's your living room, and then you have 2 bedrooms. And then the question is like how many people can live in that before it's overhoused? And so the thought is that depending on how you define it, if properly housed actually means 1 additional bedroom that's left open for like an office, that's actually underhoused. And so if you're living in affordable housing, they're trying to create an incentive now for you to rent out that additional room for $65 a day or something like that, as opposed to like what you were talking about with like the $300 a night. And you just read this and you're like, There's so many horror stories that could be created by this. I mean, you're gonna, and this is the problem. It's like if you had, if you ever, you're going to create so many stereotypical crimes where someone's going to rent out to a migrant, then they're going to murder their family, and then it's going to be this is what all people who come across the border illegally do, and then you're going to have a candidate who does a bunch of dog whistles, and it's just you're just setting yourself up like this incompetence is why we have so many of the problems that we have with our immigration system. And I mean, I guess sure, if I'm a tenant in Yonkers, like, and I have an extra room, I guess I'll rent out to Jose. I mean, I'm Joe and he's Jose. It sounds great, but if it's my sister Abigail, I have a little bit more of a problem with Jose, like, and it's nothing, it's nothing personal. It's just, but the thing is that the rent is so high in New York right now that people are desperate. And so of course, yeah, you know what, if you can get $65 a night on your rent, that's okay. Yeah.
Well, and in the hotel. So one of the examples I was reading about, the hotel filed for bankruptcy during COVID because lockdowns, they didn't have any guests and financial times got tough. So they filed for bankruptcy. In their bankruptcy hearing, as they're, it's Chapter 11, so they're looking to be resolved, they got this government contract to house these migrant individuals. They're now looking to see a $10 million profit. So within a couple of years, going from bankruptcy, not even a couple of years, within a year, going from bankruptcy to now $10 million profit, and they're completely fine because of this housing. So it's just madness. I think the thing that really gets me going here is, first, you have migrants coming from countries oftentimes because they're in very tough situations. I mean, let's not pretend like they're just coming here because it's a better country. They're coming here because they're running away from horrible situations.
Oh yeah, the stereotype is that they're coming here to suck off the government. That's to suck off the tit of the government. That's the phrase I always hear in far right circles. Like, they're coming here to suck the tit of the government, And it's like, shut up and go back to Oklahoma. Like, I'm sorry.
I'm not going to get up and move to California because I like surfing. I'm going to do it because but if Pennsylvania starts killing me or threatening my life, I might move there. That's the whole thing. But I'm pro immigration, but I cannot stand this whole open border narrative. And I think the left is doing it to themselves, and they're going to prove themselves wrong by this policies of saying everything is okay. Come here. You are safe. There's no stipulations of living here. We will take care of you. No economy can support that, because what is going to happen is incentivize people to move there. If you're in a really rough situation and you can live in Manhattan, the one of the best cities in the world, it's the place every movie's takes place in. Why wouldn't you do it? You get to live in a nice hotel and then have possible the opportunity for the American dream. Yeah, you're going to do it every time. And then you see this massive influx of migration happen thereafter. It's incentives. Well, I mean, why wouldn't a migrant do it?
And you also see this
what it leads to is in these.
We also see this.
You see this with homelessness as well.
Yeah, because everyone's like, "All right, fine. We have a problem with homelessness. People."
But no. Here's the point I want to make. The point I want to make though is they incentivize these people to come, and they think it's all going to be okay because they're taking care of human beings, but they're going to destroy every institution that they create and the individuals that are participating, and really harm individuals, these migrants who are, they're dependent on the government right now because they're in a transitional period, and the government's going to really let them down, setting up in these horrible conditions. There's going to be situations, and it's going to feed right into the Breitbart narrative that every single migrant is a rapist, murderer, will steal from you. The stats around that are migrants do not cause more crime than Native populations, simply because they don't want to lose their chance of coming to America. Well, and so there's lower crime rates and a lot of isolated incidents within migrant populations. But by creating these situations, you're going to have more and more stress on the communities that are supporting them, and they're going to resent this. Instead of having refugees that come here because they need help and we take care of them, you're going to have populations that are pushed out because they are set up to fail. And I think that's where the whole conversation has gone really bad. The left is saying, come here, we'll take care of you at all costs. And that's not possible. And then you have let's build the wall and just stop all of immigration, which is not possible either for our country.
Well, yeah. And I think one of the most frustrating aspects of this issue is that if you look at the Syrian refugee crisis back when Assad was using chemical weapons on his own people, it created a refugee crisis like unrecognizable to the average American. If you lived in Lebanon, over 40% of your population within a year was now Syrian refugees. We have no idea what it's like to have an invasion at our border. We have a problem. We do not have a crisis. And to me, when you start scaling these issues, like with the issues with basically being able to process people, identify people, and then see if they're people that would be suitable for our country, before you to make the determination on whether or not you deport them, we have a need for this amount of people coming into our country, but we have no ability to come up with a immigration system to vet these people, to let them in. Because the fact of the matter is that we have an aging population, we have a declining labor participation rate, and we have people flooding across our border who are between the ages of 25 and 40. Like the chief demographic that we need right now is between the age of 25 and 40. Working adults that can pay into that can make payroll taxes, to pay into Social Security, that can fund our elderly. Because the way it works is that as a population grows, but its birth rate declines, because in the U.S. we have a declining birth rate. If you go back to the 1960s, the birth rate was 3.1%, and today it's 1.66%. When that happens, and the population growth continues to grow, it's because of the increase in life expectancy. So back in the 80s, we had a life expectancy of 73. Presently, we have a life expectancy of around 79. And by the year 2050, it's projected that we'll have a life expectancy of 85. So what's happening is that the people who are at the end are having their lives pretty much extended, but there's fewer and fewer people being born. And so And it's kind of a morbid discussion, but what happens when you're old and you're retired is that you're primarily a consumer of resources. And so the idea over time has been that people who are who are retired have a lot of capital that they can give to people who are younger than them to invest back into the economy, and this will act as a source of stimulus for the country. But the problem is there's too much capital and there's not enough labor. That's what we're running into right now. And we have at our southern border millions and millions and millions. And now we have people in New York, we have people in California, we have people in Massachusetts. We have people who've come into this country that are of the chief demographic that we need. And our country has no ability to process them. We have no ability to basically assimilate them into our culture. And to me, it's an indictment of the failure of our immigration system. And so I like the idea that we're paying $300 a night for people living in New York who can't even legally work. Like what? Oh, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have to be that way. You can legally rent an apartment, okay? Have a regular family and work a regular job. Okay, and the apartment's not going to cost you $300 a night.
$9,000 a month. It's $9,000 a month.
Yeah,
$9,000. Well. So I'm going to say two things here, contradict myself. I completely disagree with you, but I love the data you support. And the way I disagree with you is I don't think you said it's not a crisis. I think it is a crisis, but I think the data you mentioned supports me thinking it's a crisis. Although we maybe aren't at crisis levels quite yet, where we can still absorb the migrants coming in, this is getting to be crisis levels.
Well, okay, it's a crisis. It's definitely a crisis. It's definitely a crisis. And let me clarify that. It's absolutely a crisis because there's nothing worse. Have millions of people flood across your border, and then you can't even effectively assimilate them into the culture. Like you can't make them. You can't
Not
make
even to
them
mention the
useful
assimilating of the
citizens.
culture. We can't
Like,
even support them. New York City is about to go, is financially struggling. We can't support them. Not even mentioning like assimilation and the whole
assimilation isn't the right word. What I mean is they get them acclimated into the culture to basically be able to work, be able to open up bank accounts, be able to get driver's licenses, and make an income, pay into our tax system. Like the problem isn't that we have 8 million or however more people here. The problem is that these people cannot contribute. That we have people of the exact age demographic that we need.
And they want to get jobs. We don't have a process to set them up. It's not like they're coming here because they're lazy and they want to. I've never met someone who migrates here who travels thousands of miles under horrible conditions and then sits on their couch all day. These are hardworking individuals. So I think part of what I want to add on to all that great data there of these are the prime contributing age demographics coming here is a whole H-1B visa, which is essentially the visa which is applied if you are coming here and oftentimes for jobs or universities, highly educated individuals typically. So we have no more than 85,000 of these visas a year. And the process is extremely competitive. It's very tough to get this. And, anyone who knows anyone maybe from college who was from a different country and then tried to stay here for work, I mean, they know the process. It is tough to get this. And there's a cap. I mean, another cap is no more than 7% per country can come here. So if England hits their quota of 7%, no one else can get in that year. This population here is very critical, I think, for the future of America. The average H-1B visa worker is making $108,000 a year. Many of these are STEM-related jobs, so your science, your engineers, and they're doing a lot for our country. If we do not accept many of these people, what they do is they go back to their country. Oftentimes, they're educated in America. They go to the Ivy Leagues, the best schools in the country and the world, and then they go home and implement it there. Great for those countries. I'm not bashing it. Why don't we keep them here? We educate them here, and they want to stay here. Then let's develop a path to get them here. Well, I'm not saying we have to keep them here if they come here, but if they want to, and they're highly qualified and great workers, why do we not make it easy for them to come and retain that knowledge?
Here's the thing: I have direct experience. Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a gap. I think there's a little bit of a gap between us time-wise on the pod, but I have direct experience with this. I made a bunch of really, really good friends. So my girlfriend is actually an international student who I met through what we call an LLM program. It's a master's program for a master's of law, and it's very popular for international students who have basically an undergraduate degree in law from a university, maybe in Europe or in the Middle East or in Africa, and they decide to come on over here and get a master's in law. And so almost all the LLMs are internationals here at the law school I currently go to, and of all the international students, almost half of them couldn't find jobs. And that's already a somewhat deceptive metric. Like, okay, so because this is obviously a very small sample size, but they only qualify to apply for about 2% of available jobs out there. And it's because people will say, okay, a company that's looking to hire, you have to pay a substantial amount of money to sponsor somebody. It's very, very expensive for a company to sponsor. So not only do they need to have a lot of qualifications to even be able to get the visa to come over here and get educated at the U.S., but for them to be able to stay in the U.S., they have to find a company that's willing to pay them more money than they would pay an American citizen. And it's not just a little bit of money; it's a lot of money. And what ends up happening ultimately is that their salary just gets cut by the amount that the company has to pay the government. So they get paid like very, very low, a very low salary. But we were when of the international student community, we had people from India, we had people from China, we had people from Nepal, we had people from Palestine, we had people from Paraguay, all over the world, everywhere, and roughly half of them weren't even able to find jobs. And I mean, these are not dumb people. We had someone who wasn't able to find a job that started her own law firm in Ukraine.
A war-torn country, and doing something impressive. Well,
I mean, it's
I
nuts.
remember going, having classes with immigrants here on student visas, and then come time to graduate, they can't find jobs, and sometimes you need 3-6 months after school to get a job. It's just how it works. But these are people who are outperforming me in school and doing all these extracurriculars, not to mention the culture shock they were experiencing and navigating greatly. And we just let them go home because we made the process too difficult for them.
Actually, so another example of this is one of my girlfriend's cousins went to MIT for I believe it was like software engineering or something, and he was the top of his class, graduated the top of his class. He was not able to find someone who would sponsor his visa, so he moved to Canada. And that's actually what's been happening, is that I'm not a huge fan of this guy, but Justin Trudeau has actually been very, very pro-immigrant. And overall, I don't like Justin Trudeau. But I think on this issue, I think
Justin just Trudeau's to mention on Justin Trudeau, he's worth mentioning. Arguably the best dressed leader in the world.
You cut me off at the worst spot. I literally said Justin Trudeau's been sound, and then you cut me off. Like that's not the guy's just like a fascist. I mean, but anyway, on immigration, I think he's actually he's been pretty good because
blood. He's Fidel Castro's blood, so it's tough to.
He spoke kindly of Fidel. That's great. Yeah, I love people whose first name is Fidel. It's just phenomenal.
Anyways, but back to your point of immigration in Canada.
So a lot of these folks who can't find jobs here in the U.S., they end up just going to Canada, which has a much more open immigration system, and so we're losing tons of intellectual capital to our northern neighbors. And Canada has a worse demographics problem. I mean, I don't mean to go into a spiel about Canada, but very, very briefly, Alberta is compensating for all the other provinces that aren't having children, and so you're seeing people in Alberta be taxed out the wazoo because nobody in Quebec is having any kids, and so, but the way that the Trudeau administration, if that's the terminology they use up there, has been working to solve this problem is just by accepting this massive influx of immigrant labor. Now, I don't think that that's going to work in the long run, but I mainly because Canada's demographics aren't as open and they don't have a history of immigration quite like the U.S. does. And so I think that's going to be a much tougher assimilation project than maybe they anticipate. Whereas in the U.S., and I think you wanted to get into this, I think that as much flack as we get for how we treat minorities, we're actually one of the best countries for taking in people from other parts of the world. It's just an identifying mark of our history. It's on the Statue of Liberty. It's a key part of the American identity. Name anybody who has family that was here before the 1850s. It's like it's crazy. If you trace back my lineage, my family's from Switzerland. It's just it's neat that you can go and see just how over 170 years ago, my ancestors were in a totally different part of the world. And that's just such a unique feature of what it means to be American.
It is. Well, and I think it's worth kind of doing some highlight reels of the history of America and immigration here, if you don't mind there. Just because I think it's important to note we are a country of immigrants. Yes, there were native populations here before Europe, but America, most of the leadership has always been immigrants. So kind of, kicking off, you have Thomas Paine in Common Sense, his pamphlet there. He writes about American, or at that point, colonists need to shift from thinking themselves as Brits and moving to Americans. It's a kind of a shift in mentality, saying we are American, we have a pride behind us, and it's also we're a united group. This is, as the Revolutionary War kicks off. So that creates a common ground. I think the framework there creates a really common ground that, yes, you might be Italian ancestry or English ancestry. At this point, Africans were not included in this population. You had to be white male. But, it was like, although we're from different backgrounds, we're the same at the end of the day. And I think that kind of sets the standard for immigration for a lot of our country. And
it's interesting. Can I make a quick point?
Go ahead.
What it means to be an American. I mean, the U.S. has such a history of racism. I mean, that's obvious, and it's not something that's unique to the U.S., but, clearly that's a problem. But one thing that's interesting is that the definition of being American is, slowly lagged behind the changing demographics of the country. So at first, we were a country of the British, and then it slowly expanded into including the Germans, and and then because for a while there was a lot of anti-German sentiment, and then it expanded to include the Italians, but that was after the Italians had to come over and basically make their footprint in the U.S. And it's also more recently it's been about the Hispanics, and so what it means to be American probably lags behind by about 20 years the reality on the ground ethnically.
Well, I think the makeup of it. So what you kind of see is around after the War of 1812, you see immigration really starting to take off. So the U.S. took a few years to get our feet on the ground, and then you see a boom leading up to the Civil War. Civil War kind of stops immigration naturally. But during this 1800s, you see a boom in the Irish. So this is during the potato famine. So a lot of Irish come over, and you see some other population, a lot of English still. Very much an English Britain country at this point. And then leading up to the Civil War, you have the Know Nothing Party. So this is a party that their famous line was, "We know nothing," so that's where their name comes from. Great history about them. They're the first anti-immigration party. So this is 75 years in the making of the U.S. And so that kind of pushes into the Civil War. They butt up against each other there. So immigration falls for two reasons. Post-Civil War, there's a lot of kind of who handles immigration as states kind of fight for control, and the federal government steps in under Chai Long versus Freeman and says this is a federal government issue. Then we kind of see a second boom around the same time as that ruling of immigrants for the next about 40 years. And this is when you get a lot of Southern and Central Europe immigrants. So you see the Italians, Jewish populations really pushing. And at the same time, you see the Chinese Exclusion Act. That was 1882. So what has happened is you see a lot of European push and growth, whether there was the Irish and the potato famine, the Italians then later on, the Jewish population as pressure starts mounting leading up to World War II. During this time period, you see Asian immigration, particularly on the West, and the Chinese Exclusion Act comes out of that. It's kind of the Know Nothing Party sets the groundwork for that anti-immigration, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act happens, which opens up exclusion to other populations as well, sets the footing there. So you kind of have an interesting dynamic of we want certain people, we don't want others. So just 10 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act, Ellis Island opens in New York City, where you just see massive influx, millions and millions of people come through Ellis Island. And then you get to a point where 3/4 of New York City's population in 1910 is made up of first-generation immigrants or new immigrants. So, I mean, it's just a massive push there. But this is all during the time of Industrial Revolution. So cities need more populations to complete industrial tasks, moving away from agriculture. So there's a lot of push there. But that's when, things again, you see kind of these ebbs and flows in American history. Pro-immigration, you see peaks, and then you see down. So end of 1920s, you start seeing more anti-immigration sentiment. So 1924, U.S. Border Patrol is established. This is to stop the Mexican border crossings, which ironically enough was mainly Asian immigrants coming through the Mexican border crisis, or the Mexican border, who were excluded due to the Chinese Exclusion Act and other related bills. And then leading up, World War II, you have the Japanese internment camps, and a lot of anti-immigration. During Great Depression, they actually shipped or sent back immigrants from most notably Mexico, who they had brought before during World War I to help with labor. So you have this, now we're in this low period. World War II, 1950s or 1940s, kind of a low immigration period. But the 1950s, the GI Bill comes out, economy is doing great. Suddenly individuals are expanding the economy, and we need more immigration to support that. So you see the Asian Exclusion Acts, they go away. And in 1965, Johnson passes the Immigration and Nationality Act, which kind of shifts the focus on immigration, goes more towards skilled and family reunification. So, this is kind of a boom period then for immigration again. But then in the 1980s, under Reagan, you have the first amnesty laws passed. So Reagan provided amnesty to 3 million Americans, or 3 million immigrants who then became Americans. But at the same time, also beefing up kind of immigration by opposing sanctions on employers who had unauthorized immigrants. So saying, hey, if you're here, you get amnesty, but then we want to try to stop this. Ends up having kind of the reverse effect. You see immigration continue to rise since Reagan. So although Biden does not have the best track record, the trend has continued really since Reagan. So it's not like a new issue. It's just getting exacerbated. So the last really comprehensive immigration bill that was proposed was in 2001. So this was by Dick Durbin and Orrin Hatch. So Orrin Hatch, the late Orrin Hatch, died last year, and Dick Durbin, who served many times. This included provisions for Dreamers. So this is where the Dreamers really starts becoming a topic of focus when talking about immigration. This fails. So 2001, it's the last real comprehensive immigration act ever proposed. It fails.
Oh, I think there was one under Obama with the Gang of Eight.
To an extent, yeah. I wouldn't say it's a fully comprehensive to really solve the issue and reform totally. Like you could see in education has had multiple comprehensive bills. Since then, I this is more of a personal opinion. I think we've had a lot of Band-Aid solutions passed within bills. We haven't had a comprehensive bill that represents what the public needs, what the public wants since my lifetime. And it keeps exacerbating this issue. So now we're moving into this whole period of executive orders. So every administration comes in and gets to control what's happening, moving away from the legislature making decisions. So the Dreamer Act fails in 2001. Obama comes in and he passes an executive order for the DACA and Dreamers. Trump comes in then in 2016, 2017, and basically is able to reverse that and do whatever he wants. There's not that checks and balances. And that kind of leads us to today of this.
Well, I think the court
Each
actually
party,
struck him down revoking DACA.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's kind of like let's see how far executive orders can go as a way of curtailing the lack of comprehensive reform that the legislative branch should be doing.
Yeah. Well, I think also the underlying narrative, and the reason I kept kind of bringing this up earlier is people ask, why don't things get done? One, you have oh god, there's so many factors, but one is, for a long time, Republicans were basically had this narrative that if you get amnesty, you create a supermajority for Democrats, you guarantee their election for the next 3 decades. But then there's also this, it's not clear that there's really political will. Like, there's a lot of immigrant sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment in the country, and so that's also fueled a lot of the Republican politicians. And so just not just that they'll vote Democrat, it's that people don't really want more immigrants coming into the country, and that combined with the previous one has created kind of this political roadblock. And there's really an economic need for more people to come into the country. Like, we've had declining birth rates, and we're well beneath a replacement rate. And so we need people coming into the country. And so it's a very cynical take, but if you're trying to understand the currents beneath the immigration issue, the economy desperately needs people who are of working age to come into the country, whether it's through illegal immigration or legal immigration. Big companies need workers. And so it's going to happen. And then, the current administration will try to hide it, or they'll try to think, oh yeah, well, sorry. But it's something that there are economic pressures here that are at work that I feel like very people know about. People don't realize that the labor participation rate is the lowest it's really ever been. I mean, if you take out the Great Depression, and so they don't realize that a smaller and smaller group of people is having to support the whole economy. There was a stat that I saw that said that for every if you increase the population, if the share of the population over 60 increases by 10%, you lose 5% of GDP annually. That's how much of a tax on the economy you take when the population ages. And so it really, really hurts our country if we age. And so we have to be bringing people in. And when I was talking about the crisis earlier, is that the biggest crisis that we have is it's not that people want to come into the country, it's that we can't process them and get them to utilize them, essentially, to pay into our system. And so that's a major problem.
Yeah, I share this graph here. I just thought this was relevant to share in talking about that. You can see this blue line is the number of immigrants, and for those not listening or not who are only listening, so you have a blue line and then an orange line. The blue line is number of immigrants. The orange line is immigrants as a percentage of U.S. population. And what it shows is the immigrants as percentage of U.S. population from 1860 to 2020 has remained kind of within this like 5 to 15% range throughout the entire time. We're right now around like 14%. So on the higher end, but still like not surpassing any levels we have in the past. Whereas the number of immigrants has skyrocketed. So over 40% of the population in 2020 was immigrants. So this is a new immigrant, not, I'm a immigrant 4 generations ago. So this is new immigration. So basically what's happening is percentage of the U.S. population immigrants is remaining steady because we aren't having enough children, where immigrants are subsidizing in a way the lack of native born kids. I think that graph I felt, just supports this comes from migrationpolicy.org.
And that they're kids, and that they're also having kids.
Right.
So yeah, no, that's interesting. That's super interesting. Well, I feel like there's so much more we could go into, but I think we are coming up on we've gone over our hour here. But I think this is something that we're going to try and translate into future discussions. I know that we both want to discuss demographics at an in-depth level. But
which
demographics and immigration they're intricately linked. But for those still listening, if there's any of you left out there, for those still listening, next week Jacob and I will be talking about student loans. We want to that's something certainly applicable to me because I am in law school. We'll be looking at debt forgiveness. We'll be looking at maybe some of like the tax advantages that student loan forgiveness gives. We'll also be looking at whether or not it's a good idea for student debt forgiveness to occur. How does that stimulate the economy? How does it not? And there'll be a whole host of discussions that we'll have on that subject. But then afterwards, we're looking here in the near future to be having an in-depth conversation about demographics, probably covering issues like urbanization, how why fertility rates go down, and why you're seeing industrialized countries rapidly lose fertility rates, and if there's any sort of sustainable model that can be created where you would live in a hyper industrialized economy but have a viable replacement rate. So that's all coming down the pipeline. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, share this with your friends. We are just getting off the ground, and so we're trying to turn this into something that we can be proud of. So I think for today, that marks the end of the now 7th episode of Yuppies and Harpoons. We really, really appreciate you guys again listening. It also leave a review if you can. That really helps as well. So, but until then, Jacob, I will see you next week.
And can I do a real quick
sure.
shout out to someone? Friend of mine, Daniel Lemon. I know he's been listening well, so shout out to him and anyone who's been listening to a lot of our episodes here. We'd love to hear more from you and engage more with you. So if you have thoughts and want to follow up with something we said, we'd love to hear more from you. So don't hesitate to reach out, subscribe, so forth.
Yeah, well, Carson, I can't say your last name because we know you work in high secret locations and just can't be disclosing that information.
Well,
but Carson,
call him Bob.
Yeah, if you see his last name in the comments, do not disclose who this is. Yes, and don't spread it around. But Carson, I appreciate you listening. Anthony, you know who you are. Your last name's Markavage. You're not important. So if you need legal services, you can go and you can certainly go and check him out. Actually, no, I don't think he offers this anymore. I think he got disbarred. No, I'm kidding. I'll get defamation here really soon. Oh, I gotta stop.
Yeah, you're setting us up for legal issues already. Come on.
Man. Yeah, that's not good. I'm in law school. This is. I can't afford it.
You meant a fictional character that I'm writing in my book, Anthony, right? Not a real human Anthony, right? Anyways, I think that might be. That might be a wrap
about partnerships today. Yeah. So I need to learn about liability and partnerships. So, all right, guys. Again, in all seriousness, we will see you next Wednesday. The Wi-Fi will not go down. I'll see you then with Jacob on Wednesday next week. So yeah.